We're now on Daf Mem Heyamid Beis. Elim Merubim, V'lo Yehelem Eifasan. And they don't have the appropriate Menachos. Zyovi Ayel Echad V'Eifaso. Better to bring it B'Shlemus, that one single aisle with its Ephah. V'lo Yakrivu Kulam below Ephos. And this leads us to the Mishnah here on the top of Daf Mem Heyamid Beis. Haparva Elim. And now we're talking about Chag HaShavuos, and we're talking about the karbanos that have to accompany the Shtei Lechem in Parshas Emor. And although the three categories, we're going to focus on two out of three, the Ola and the Chatos. Hapar va'elim va'kvosim va'soyer ein ma'akvim es lechem v'lo lechem ma'akva. According to the Tanakama, the number of the animals, the karbanos of Ola, that have to, if everything is perfect, have to accompany the Shtei Lechem is not ma'akiv. In other words, you could bring the Shtei Lechem even without any of the karbanos of the Ola and the Chatas. So even though the Torah tells us that you have to bring an Ola of a par, plus Shnei Elim and Shiva Kvasim, if he brought none of those, he could still bring the Shtei Lechem. And the opposite is true as well, V'lo Lechem Akvan. If, let's say, he doesn't have Shtei Lechem, he could go ahead and bring the Karbanos Ola that we mentioned before of a par, Elim, Kvasim, and Soyer, even without the Shtei Lechem. And we're going to soon see a sheet of Rab Shimon ben Nanas, otherwise known as Ben Nanas for short, that he disagrees. Halechem ma'akiv es ha-kvasim, v'en ha-kvasim ma'akvim es halechem divrei Rabbi Akiva. Now this part of the Mishnah that we're reading now is universally accepted. There's no controversy. And that is that although there were kvasim that would accompany the lechem of Shavuos was totally independent of the kvasim, meaning that the kvasim are not essential to the Shtei Lechem, and the reverse is also true, and that is ein lechem akvim es hakvasim. If you don't have lechem, you still bring the kvasim, the 7 lambs. So, according to some girsa, you don't write. It shouldn't say divrei Rabbi Akiva because again that implies that he's arguing, but nobody argues about this anyway. However, now we're going to go back to the beginning of the Mishnah as far as whether the lechem, the Shtei Lechem, is essential for all the karbanos Ola that accompany it, and the reverse. And we say that then ein ma'akvim zed zeh. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Nanas lo ki. It's not so. Not a low key, L-O-W-K-E, but no, low key, but rather, Ella hakvosim ma'akvis alechem einem akvis, because it's a one-way street. You cannot bring the lechem without kvosim. If you don't have kvosim, don't bother with the lechem. But you can bring the kvosim that are meant to accompany the lechem, even in the absence of lechem. It's a one-way street. Now the Mishnah is going to give an explanation for Ben Nanas. I don't know why his father was given that name. I mean, my father was also pretty short, but nobody called him a Nanas. Anyway, but the Mishnah is going to give an explanation. The Gemara is going to give a totally different explanation. The Rishonim are going to work hard to try to reconcile the two. But let's see what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah says, "She came at Tzinuk Shayav Yisrael b'Midbar Barim Shana Karvu Kvasim V'Lo Lechem." We find, says Ben Nanas, that during the 40 years in the Midbar, they couldn't bring lechem because the lechem had to come from Eretz Yisrael, has to be grown in the land of Israel, and they were in the Midbar. They hadn't entered into the land, but they could bring the kvasim, and that's exactly what they did. And therefore you see clearly that the kvasim can exist independent of the Shtei Lechem. That's what they did for 40 years. Afkan, so too even after we entered Eretz Yisrael, and we only have kvasim, we don't have lechem, yikruvu kvasim, below lechem. So basically, the halach is established, or at least revealed, by what went on during the 40 years in the Midbar. They brought kvasim, but not lechem. They couldn't bring lechem because they didn't have Eretz Yisrael. On Rabbi Shimon, halacha kidivrei benanas avol ein tam kidvarov. I accept the halacha of benanas, which means that there's no lechem without kvasim, but the kvasim without, you could have kvasim without lechem, but not for his reasoning. Shekol ha'amur bechumash pkudim karv b'midbar. B'chol ha'amur b'toras konim ein karv b'midbar. Says Reb Shimon, again, this is not Reb Shimon ben Nana, this is Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, but he says that guess what? All the korbanos of Toras Konim, Parshas Emor that were meant to accompany the lechem were not brought for 40 years in the Midbar. You're making a big boo-boo. And if you'll tell me, but during the 40 years of the Midbar, in fact, they brought a whole bunch of kvasim, that's from Chumash Pekudim. That's the Musaf service. That has nothing to do with the parsha of Shtei Lechem in Sefer Vayikra, in Parshas Emor. Mishabola Aretz, once they came into Eretz Yisrael, and there was a series of korbanos of Olah that had to accompany the Lechem, is Karvei Levelu. They brought everything. Whether it's the Musaf service of Chumash HaPekudim, whether or not it's the Shtei Lechem service of Parshas Emor, they brought it out because now you can bring the Lechem. So once you have the Lechem, you bring the Kvasim to accompany the Lechem. So then, once I slugged up the reasoning of Benanas, why do I accept Benanas? And that is that you can have kvasim without lechem, you can't have lechem without kvasim. Okay, this last explanation here of Reb Shimon is what I call kudshim, really real kudshim. Okay, now let's take a regular korban, and there are 4 matirim, which is called the avodas hadam. From Shechita till Zrika. So therefore, when you bring these kvasim, they have their own matir. Right? And that matir will be matir 2 things. So it'll be matir the Evarim for Aktorah Gabi Mizbeach, and be matir the basar for Achilas Kohanim. I'm not talking about an Ola right now, but I'm saying. So those are the matirim that are built into the korban. However, what's the matir of the Shtei Lechem? The Shtei Lechem would be eaten by the Kohanim. What allows the Kohanim? What permits it for the Kohanim? The answer is the Kvasim. So Reb Shimon ben Anas is correct according to Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. Why? Because it's impossible to bring the Lechem without the Kvasim because there is no matir. The matir for the Lechem is the Kvasim. If there's no Kvasim, there's no matir. Hence, they can't bring the korban of the Shtei Lechem. And now we're up to the Gemara. Ton Rabbanu, we learned to the Brisa with regard to Shtei Lechem of Chag HaShavuos. The Torah says, "V'kravtem al halechem." Al halechem. What does that mean, al halechem? So the Brisa says, "Chova al halechem," which seems to indicate that the whole purpose of the kvasim is al halechem, which would therefore mean there's no meaning whatsoever, no significance to kvasim without lechem. But yet, if we look at the end of the pasuk, it says shivas kvasim tmimim, which sounds like the kvasim stand on their own. Afal pishein lechem, but it came out tabel over al lechem. How do we reconcile this? So the Brisa says, "Melavit shelo nischayvu b'kvasim kodem shenischayvu b'lechem." Divrei Rabbi Tarfon. So Rabbi Tarfon claims that the kvasim in Parshas Emor that were meant and designed to accompany the Shtei Lechem would not be brought during the 40 years in the desert, and the reason for that is because there's no Shtei Lechem. And that's what the pasuk means when it says V'kravtem al halechem. So for the 40 years in the midbar, there's no al halechem because the lechem has to be from grown, freshly cut from the growing of kedushas karka of Eretz Yisrael, and therefore the whole chiyuv of kvasim, which is generated by shtei lechem, could not emerge during the 40 years, says Rabbi Tarfon, because there was no lechem. But Rabbi Akiva Omer, Yochol hein kvasim amurim kan, hein kvasim amurim bechumash pekudim. In other words, maybe we'll say that when the Torah says v'kravto alechem, maybe it's the very same, shiva kvasim that are mentioned in Parshas Pekudim. So how do you know that there are two different sets of kvasim? Amarta, shetamagia etzel parim v'elim einon hein. I'm going to prove to you that the number of parim and elim that are mentioned in Parshas Pekudim is not the same as the number of parim and elim that are mentioned in Parshas Emor with regard to the Shtei Alecha, because in Bamidbar it says Shnei Parim and Ayal Echad. So you bring two bulls for the Musaf service of Shavuos and one single ram. If you look in Parshas Emor with regard to the Elim and the parim that accompany the Shtei Lechem, there it says not Shnei Parim but Par Echad, not Ayal Echad but Shnei Elim. Elos, you have no choice but to say Halolu Boim Biglal Atzma, Halolu Boim Biglal Lechem. Right, the Korban Musaf service of Parshas of Sefer Bamidbar. Right? I'm blanking out for a second what parsha it is. Just give someone. Okay, it'll come to me in a second. Anyway, so that's separate, totally independent of the seder of parim v'elim that accompany the Shtei Lechem in Sefer Vayikra and Parshas Emor. And therefore, nimtza masha omer b'chumash pekudim kar b'midbar, masha omer b'toras kohanim lo kar b'midbar. Right? So in the seder of parim and elim that accompany the Shtei Lechem in Sefer Vayikra, that couldn't be brought in the Midbar. Vayikra here is called Toras Kohanim because they didn't have lechem, and the whole purpose was v'kraftem ala lechem. On the other hand, the seder of Shnei Parim and Ayal Echad that came in the Korban Musaf in Chumash Pekudim, that was brought in the Midbar because it had nothing to do with the Shtei Lechem. It only has to do with the Korban Musaf. So Gemara says, I don't get it. V'dilma Parim v'elim lav inhu, hakvasim inhu, ninhu. Right? The number Shiva Kvasim, 7 Kvasim, appears both in Vayikra and in Bamidbar. So it's the identical. Okay, so you've made a case for Parim and Elim, right? The numbers just don't stim. But as far as the Kvasim is so they stim. So the answer is mida hani ishni hani nami. From the fact that as far as Parim and Elim, there's a different, obviously a difference between Parshas Pekudim and Parshas Toras Kohanim. Obviously, then we're going to apply the same logic to the Kvasim. Parim v'elim imayde ishtenu. Dilma Hachikumar. How do you know that there are different parim and elim between Parshas Pekudim and Parshas Toras Kohanim? Dilma. Perhaps I could suggest, if I want to be argumentative, about a Hachikumar Rachmana, iboy par ushnei elim wikarev, iboy shnei parim ve'aylecha wikarev. Again, I will say I find this very difficult, but the Gemara is suggesting that the Torah gave two options to the Kohen. As if to say, you could decide whatever you like. You could either decide for 1 par and 2 elim, or for 2 parim and 1 ayil. He says here in the footnote that based on Ibn Ezra, or something that the Gemara is suggesting that maybe the key of keys is the number, the final number. You have to have two parim in one aisle, or two aislim in one par, and you end up with the same number. So the Gemara says, no, that's not possible. Ishtani sidram shmam nachrini ninu. This is very interesting. In Vayikra, Parshas Emor, you find that the Torah lists first the Sheva Kvasim, then the Par, and finally the Shnei Elim. In Chumash Pekudim, you start with the Shnei Parim, which again is not the same number, but it's a different sequence as well. And then you go to Ayel Echad, and then finally at the very end, you have Shiva Kvasim. So it can't be the same. All right, let's go back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Halechem ma'akiv es hakvasim. Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion, again, if we quote in the name of Rabbi Akiva, this part is Rabbi Akiva, that you cannot bring the kvasim without the lechem. Rav Shimon ben Anna says, no, it's just the reverse. You cannot bring the shtei lechem without the kvasim. My time of the Rabbi Akiva, Gomar Yu Mitiyena. Very interesting Zereshava. It's not the same word, and the Gemara is going to make a big deal about this. But it's the same shorish, it's the same root of the word, whether it's Yehu or Tiyena. And the word Tiyena shows up 3 psukim before Yehu, right? Yehu is not going to be until Pasuk Chaf, whereas Tiyena is already in Pasuk Yud Zayin. And therefore, based on this Gzeira Shavar, Rabbi Kiva argues that Mala Halon Lechem, that the Tihiyu, which always tells me essentiality, in Pasuk Yud Zayin, is Lechem. I mean, that's explicit in the Torah. Is Afkan Lechem. Here the word Yiyu, or it doesn't say Tiyena, in Pasuk Chaf, also is referring to Lechem. So therefore, when the Pasuk mentions the lambs that are being brought, and it says Yiyu, then it's got to be Yiyu with the Tiena of Pasuk Yud Zayin, which is Lechem. So there's no Kvasim without Lechem. And that's what the Mishnah says in the name of Rabbi Kiva, that a Lechem Akiv es HaKvas. What does Ben Nanas do with this whole business? Does he have a different Gzeira Shava? And therefore he reverses the whole story, and the Kvasim are Ma'akiv es HaLechem, v'ein HaLechem Ma'akiv es HaKvasim. Ben Nanas Gomar Yiyu. I would rather, says Ben Nanas, look for the exact same word in order to construct the Gzeira Shava, and I do find the exact same word in Pasuk Yud Ches. And the Pasuk Yud Ches is not referring to the Lechem, but rather to the Kvasim. It's Malan Kvasim, Afkan Kvasim. So if you're asking me what is absolutely critical, which is always derived from the word Yihu or Tihu, the answer is the Kvasim are critical. Not the way Rabbi Akiva had it, that the Shtei Lechem is critical. Ubenanas nami nelef mitiyena, ma lahalan lechem afkan lechem, donim yiu miyu, v'yein donim yiu mitiyena. So Benanas goes on record as saying that in order to construct a valid Gzeira Shava, you have to have the same exact word, yiu and yiu, but not tihiyena. Now, I actually, when I learned this Gemara yesterday, I covered the next piece of Gemara, and I said it out on my own, because I knew exactly what's coming on the next line of the Gemara, because we've seen this over and over again throughout Shas. Ma'inaf Gemina, Hatana Debe Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel gave us the rules for, biblical exegesis, and he taught us a Gzeira Shava from 2 different words entirely, and yet there's a Gzeira Shava. V'shav HaKohen u'ba HaKohen. Now, in one pasuk it says V'shav HaKohen, and the other pasuk it says u'ba HaKohen. Right? Shav means to return, and ba means to come. They have 2 different meanings, 2 different words, and yet he derives a Gzeira Shava, Zeh Shiva, Zeu Shiva, Zeu Bia. Okay, so this is in the parsha of Taras Mitzora, not Mitzora, but Nigei Batim, and we link up these 2 psukim of Vishav and Uba through the Gzeira Shava, and the laws that apply to one apply to the other. In any event, this is as far as the details of taking out the stones that were afflicted with uh, nigay batim, and you have to scrape off the surrounding plaster. You have to lay new stones, and you have to wait a week to see what develops. And although the Torah doesn't mention this procedure explicitly in regard to returning to the house, but the Gzeir Tov teaches the same procedure applies there as well. In any event, you see that there's a Gzeir Shava with two words that are not even the same. So why does Menachos insist that the words have to be the same? So now the Gemara backtracks on our understanding of Tanad Bei Rabbi Shmuel, and Tanad Bei Rabbi Shmuel is not an absolute rule. True, you can set up Gzeir Shava between two different words, but only if you have no other option. It's a last resort. If you can't find another word that's similar, then we'll give you the liberal, ability to make Gzeir Shava. But if in the same parsha you'll find another word that's identical, then we're going to derive the Gzeir Shava from those two words that are identical. Why does he reject what seems to be at least a smoother ride of Gzeir Shava? Yiyu Benanas's Gzeir Shava. Done in Dover Shematona Lekoim, in Dover Shematona Lekoim, La Fuke Hani Di Olos Ninu. Okay. Now, the difference, as we know, and we've heard it thousands of times, between an Ola and all other Karbonos, is that in the case of an Ola, it's Kula Kolil. Nothing is there for the Kohen. Whereas in the case of Shtei Alechem, the Shtei Alechem are given to the Kohen. So therefore, says Rabbi Kiva, I would prefer, even if it means a stretch in the words of the two words for the Gzeir Shava, I'd rather prefer Gzeir Shava, which combines two things that belong to a Matan LeKohen, from stretching it out to a Karban Ola, as Benanas did, when an Ola has no gift to the Kohen at all. Iboy Sema, another explanation of Machlok Shin Rabbi Kiva and Benanas, Ema Bekra Gufe Kamifli, this Pasuk Chaf is the subject of their controversy. Kodesh Yiu Lashem LaKohen. Rabbi Kiva Savar Ezu Dover Shekula LaKohen. Right, it says in the Pasuk that it's La Kohen. Have he Omer Lechem? Lechem is given to the Kohen, the whole Lechem, the entire Shtei Lechem. Who Benanas? Benanas says Miksiv Kodesh Yiyah Yu La Kohen. It doesn't say that the Kodesh is given to the Kohen. It says Kodesh Yu Lashem La Kohen. And here we get into a parsha which is called Gezel Hager. Are you familiar with it? I think we had it a few times. And Gezel Hager means that if you steal something from a convert, meaning a non-Jew who converted, and he has no relatives, let's say, he could have relatives, he had children after his gerus, but he didn't have any children after his gerus, and he dies without children. So what do? You're a thief, you're a no-good Katzalan, and you have to return the Gzela, but nevertheless, there's no one to return it to, not to the person, the Nigzal that you stole, and not to his relatives. There are no relatives. So the Torah says, La Shem, that we're going to supervise a situation, a scenario in which that Gzela is going to be given for the sake of Hashem. It can't be given for the sake of the Nigzal because he's gone without Yoshim, but it will be delivered to the Kohen. So Gezel Hager is delivered to the Kohen. The Kohen is, so to speak, the representative of Hashem. On the one hand, I'm giving it for the sake of Hashem, but on the other hand, I give it Lamaisa Befal to the Kohen. Is Haviomer Elu Kfas. Rabbi Kiva Miksiv Kodesh Yelachem Lashem HaKohen, Lashem LaKohen Ksiv, Ki Rav Huna, Di Rav Huna, Kno Hashem V'Nosel LaKohen. And in the case of a Gezel Hager, the Gezel now belongs to Hashem, but give it to the Kohen. Well, Rabbi Yochanan, with this we'll conclude, Hakol Modim, Shem Huskiku Zela Zeh, Shem Akvim Zeh, Tzeh Ve'ezi, Zika Shalem Shchita. There's a situation in which even Rabbi Akiva agrees that without the kvasim, you can't bring the shtei alechem. Even though, again, Rabbi Akiva was committed to the position that the shtei alechem stand on their own and the kvasim are non-essential, but in a case where they did the shechita of the kvasim, the shechita itself is makadesh, the shtei alechem, and now it generates a link that cannot, a bond that cannot be broken between the shtei alechem, between the kvasim and the shtei alechem. And therefore, if you don't have the kvasim, whatever happens, they got puzzled, they got lost, whatever it might be, then you can't bring the shtei alechem, even according to Rabbi Akiva. Okay, then, so this is where we'll stop for today, and hopefully be back tomorrow at noon.